A distracted millionaire, talking on the phone, buys an ice cream for his 2-year-old son at the airport. Seconds after the first bite, the unthinkable happens. The boy begins to choke, his face turns purple, and he cries desperately for help while dozens of people walk by, pretending not to see. Just when everything seems lost, a 7-year-old homeless girl leaves her spot by the airport door, runs to them, and does something unbelievable. The shrill ring of the cell phone seemed to pierce the constant din of the airport, a spear of urgency in a sea of flight announcements and the rolling of suitcases. Richard Sterling pressed the device to his ear, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No, David, the deadline is non-negotiable. Close the deal today or walk away," he said, his voice low but laden with an authority that brooked no argument. His eyes, a cool and calculating blue, scanned the spreadsheets open on the laptop balanced on his knees, ignoring the world around him. Beside him, small and almost invisible in the waiting area chair, was Leo, his 2-year-old son. The boy's blonde curls fell over his forehead as his little feet, shod in tiny sneakers, dangled without touching the floor. He watched his father with the infinite patience only children possess, waiting for a crack in that business monologue. Finally, he tugged on the sleeve of Richard's expensive suit jacket. "Daddy, scream," he murmured, the word ice cream coming out imperfectly from his small mouth. Richard made an impatient gesture, brushing the little hand away. "Not now, son. Daddy's busy." But Leo insisted, his big, pleading eyes fixed on a colorful kiosk across the terminal. "Scream, Daddy, peas." Richard's sigh was audible. He glanced at his watch. Still an hour until boarding. A 5-minute distraction might buy him 30 minutes of silence. "All right, David, give me a minute," he said into the phone, and stood, pulling Leo along by the hand almost mechanically. He strode toward the kiosk, the phone still glued to his face. "What flavor do you want?" he asked his son, without really looking at him, his eyes still on the phone's screen, where a new urgent email had just arrived. Leo pointed with a tiny finger at the colorful tubs. "That one and that one." Richard barely registered the colors, a vibrant pink and a green flecked with dark specks. "Give me 1 scoop of strawberry and 1 of pistachio," he told the attendant, already pulling his wallet from his pocket. He paid, took the double scoop cone, and handed it to Leo, who held it with both hands as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "Great. Now be quiet," Richard said, and immediately turned his attention back to the call. "I'm back. David, where were we?" He sat down again, diving headfirst back into the universe of figures and clauses. For a few minutes, silence reigned, broken only by the satisfied sounds of Leo licking his ice cream. Richard felt a pang of paternal pride. He had solved the problem with efficiency, as he always did. Then, a strange sound pulled him from his concentration. A small gasp. He looked to his side. Leo's eyes were wide, his mouth open. "Son!" he called, not yet understanding. Another sound, a sharp wheeze, as if air were struggling to pass through a blocked passage. Leo's face began to change color, first an intense red, then a terrifying purplish hue. The ice cream cone fell from his hands, splattering on the polished airport floor. Panic, a strange and overwhelming feeling, rose in Richard's throat. He dropped his phone, which hit the ground with a dull thud. "Leo, what is it? Breathe, son," he yelled, scooping the boy into his arms. Leo's body was limp, his eyes rolling back. People around them began to stare, curious and frightened faces turning in his direction. "Somebody help me! My son isn't breathing!" Richard bellowed, desperation shattering the steel composure he always wore. The crowd formed a circle, but no one moved. They were merely paralyzed spectators of an impending tragedy. The air seemed to have vanished from his own lungs. In that instant, as Richard's world fell apart, a small, gaunt figure stood out in the airport's glass entryway. A girl of about 7, with worn clothes and large, observant eyes, who watched the scene with an unusual intensity. Seeing the panic in the man's eyes and the color of the boy, she didn't hesitate. She crossed the threshold and began to run toward them, breaking through the barrier of motionless bodies with a determination no one else there seemed to possess. The girl didn't ask for permission. She commanded, "Lay him on the ground, now!" Her voice, thin but surprisingly firm, cut through Richard's panic like a sharp blade. For a split second, he hesitated, his brain unable to process an order coming from a child in a faded dress and worn-out sandals. But her eyes, a deep and serious brown, held no doubt, only an urgency that mirrored the terror in his own heart. He obeyed. With trembling hands, he laid Leo's small, inert body on the cold terminal floor. The crowd shrank back, a collective murmur of shock and pity rippling through the onlookers. The girl knelt beside Leo, ignoring Richard and everyone else completely. With a gentleness that contrasted with the rawness of the situation, she tilted the boy's head back, gently opening his mouth with her small, nimble fingers to ensure his airway wasn't obstructed. "It was the green ice cream, wasn't it?" she asked, without taking her eyes off Leo's purplish face. The question was rhetorical, a statement. Richard could only nod, mute. "It has nuts. My sister can't eat it. Her throat closes up," she explained, her voice low and focused. "Don't give him water, ever. It makes it worse." Every word was a lesson harsh life had taught her. A wave of shame so intense it nearly buckled him washed over Richard. He, the man who commanded empires with a phone call, didn't know the first thing about saving his own son. And this girl, who had probably never owned an expensive toy in her life, held the knowledge that separated Leo from eternity. Under her care, something shifted. Leo's desperate wheezing began to subside, turning into a harsh, difficult, but present breath. The bluish tint around his lips started to give way to a pale pink. He wasn't okay. Far from it, but he was breathing. He was alive. The relief that flooded Richard was as overwhelming as the panic before it. He fell to his knees beside the unknown child, tears finally streaming down his face. He wanted to thank her, to ask her name, to understand how she knew, but no words would come. Just then, the distant sound of sirens became a close, insistent wail. Airport security, finally spurred to action, cleared a path through the crowd. 2 paramedics with a gurney and equipment rushed forward. "What happened here?" one of them asked, his voice professional and calm. Richard tried to answer, but his throat was tight. It was the girl who spoke, her hand still on Leo's chest, as if to feel the faint beat of his heart. "Allergic reaction. Pistachios. He needs epinephrine." The paramedics exchanged a surprised glance, but immediately got to work, administering an injection and placing an oxygen mask on Leo's face. As they moved him to the gurney, Richard's mind began to clear. Gratitude, immense and crushing, replaced the shock. He had to talk to her. He had to do something. He turned, searching for her in the chaos. And he saw her. She was backing away, retreating to the edge of the crowd. Her large eyes frightened, like a wild animal that had strayed too far from its territory and now only wanted to flee. She was blending in with the other passengers, trying to become invisible. She was almost at the glass doors, ready to disappear back into the world she came from. "Wait!" Richard shouted, his voice hoarse. He took a step toward her, but the paramedics called for him to accompany the gurney. For an instant, he was torn between his son and his savior. But when he looked back at the doors, she was already gone. The lights in the hospital room were cold and impersonal, and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was the only sound that broke the heavy silence. Leo slept, his face serene, an oxygen cannula tucked under his small nose. The doctor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, explained the situation to Richard with a professional calm that both irritated and comforted him. "It was a severe anaphylactic shock," he said. "The little girl who helped, well, she saved his life. Those first few minutes are everything. She knew exactly what to do, and more importantly, what not to do. You were incredibly lucky. The word lucky echoed in Richard's mind like an accusation. It wasn't luck, it was negligence. His negligence. He, who controlled every detail of his billion-dollar deals, who anticipated market shifts and prided himself on his strategic vision, had failed in his most fundamental role. He looked at Leo's small hand, so tiny and fragile, and felt the weight of his own absence. The image of the girl, of her serious eyes and deft hands, superimposed itself over the doctor's. Who was she? Where did that knowledge, that supernatural calm in the midst of chaos, come from? The gratitude he felt was a physical force, an urgent need to find that child and somehow repay the invaluable gift she had given him. As soon as the doctor assured him Leo was stable and would be kept for observation as a precaution, Richard made a decision. He called his wife, minimizing the severity of the incident so as not to ruin her trip. It was just a scare. He felt a little unwell. He's fine now, he lied, his voice sounding hollow to his own ears. Then he left the hospital and, instead of going home, had his driver take him back to the airport. The terminal, now quieter in the early evening, looked like an empty stage after a dramatic play. He went straight to the information desk, then to security. He explained the situation, the name Richard Sterling opening doors that would remain closed to others. He wanted the security camera footage, anything that could help him identify the girl. A security supervisor, a burly man named Mike, listened to him patiently. "Mr. Sterling, we understand your situation and we're glad your son's okay, but this is tough. Thousands of people pass through here, a little girl, without a name, without a picture. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack." Richard felt frustration build. She wasn't a passenger. She came in from outside. She was wearing a simple dress, worn-out sandals. "She saved my son. I have to find her." He described the scene again, the urgency in his voice making Mike frown in concentration. "A girl from the street. Who knew first aid for allergies?" the security man mused, skeptical. "That's unusual," Richard insisted, detailing her confidence, the way she acted. The description finally seemed to spark something in Mike's memory. "There are some kids from the Trestlewood neighborhood who sometimes hang around the entrance, selling candy, asking for a handout. But security usually moves them along," he said, hesitantly. "She might be one of them." It was the first lead, the first fragile thread to cling to. "Where is this neighborhood? How do I get there?" Richard asked, hope swelling inside him. Mike took a step back, his gaze suddenly cautious. He pointed vaguely past the runways. "It's right over there, on the other side of the wall, but, sir, that's not a place you want to go alone. It's rough." The warning hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. But for Richard, there was no danger greater than the debt he felt in his soul. He had to go, he had to find her. However, as he turned to leave, Mike added one last sentence, almost in a whisper. "And if the girl ran, sir, maybe she doesn't want to be found. Maybe she was scared of something." The next day, the morning sun cast a harsh light on the landscape that unfolded on the other side of the airport wall. It was a world apart, a labyrinth of narrow alleys and unfinished houses, where electrical wires tangled above tin roofs like a giant spiderweb. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of fried food and damp earth. Richard's driver, a discreet man named Davis, drove the luxury sedan with an uncomfortable slowness, as if the car were an exotic animal lost in hostile territory. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Sterling?" Davis asked, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Richard didn't answer. His eyes scanned the windows, the doorways, the faces of children who stopped playing to watch the imposing vehicle pass. There were many faces, but none of them were hers. Following Mike's vague directions, he stopped near a small bodega, the only visible point of commerce on the main street. The decision to get out of the car and ask questions felt like a challenge. As soon as his Italian leather shoes touched the dirt-packed ground, a silence fell over the street. Conversation ceased. The looks turned into a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. He entered the bodega, a dark, cluttered room. Behind the counter, a burly man in a tank top and a thick mustache stared at him with his arms crossed. "Morning. Can I help you?" the man said, his voice deep and devoid of any warmth. Richard cleared his throat, feeling strangely out of place. "Good morning. I'm looking for a girl, about 7 years old. Dark hair, big eyes. She was at the airport yesterday." He took a $100 bill from his wallet and placed it on the counter. "Any information would be a great help." The bodega owner looked at the bill, then at Richard, and a contemptuous smile formed on his lips. "A rich man looking for a poor little girl? That doesn't sound right, pal." The insinuation hit him like a punch. "It's nothing like that." Richard hurried to explain. "She helped my son. He had a medical emergency. I just want to thank her." He told the story, but the words felt hollow in that environment. The man took the $100 bill, folded it slowly, and tucked it into his pants pocket. "A lot of girls fit that description around here," he said, evasively. "But maybe I know who you're talking about. Her name is Lena. She lives with her younger sister, little Sophia. Their mother's not really in the picture anymore." He paused, as if weighing each word. "But finding Lena isn't that simple. She doesn't trust strangers, for good reason." The way he said it sent a shiver down Richard's spine. There was something more here, a layer of complexity he couldn't decipher. "Where can I find her?" Richard insisted. The shopkeeper shrugged. "She comes and goes, but she always takes care of her sister. If you find one, you'll find the other." He then leaned over the counter, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "Listen, if you really want to help, it's not just Lena you need to worry about. Their situation is complicated. The rent on their place is overdue. The landlord, Mr. Hawkes, is not a patient man. And there are people watching, people who think they can take advantage of a rich man like you." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of an argument outside. A woman was yelling at a child. Richard stepped out of the bodega and saw her. It was Lena. She was holding tightly to the hand of a smaller girl, who was pale and had a dry, persistent cough. A neighbor was gesturing angrily. "I told you to keep your sister away from my door. She's always sick. She'll give it to my kids," the woman shouted. Lena didn't answer. She just hugged her little sister tightly, her face a mask of defiance and protection. She raised her eyes, and for an instant, her gaze met Richard's. In it, he saw not the heroism of the previous day, but the pure fear and distrust of someone who had learned the world is a place where you can't expect help from anyone. Before he could say a word, she pulled her sister by the hand and disappeared down a narrow alley, leaving behind only dust and the echo of the neighbor's hostile words. The image of Lena's frightened eyes haunted him for the rest of the day. This wasn't the confident child from the airport, but a cornered guardian defending her small world with a ferocity born of desperation. Richard knew a direct approach wouldn't work. The distrust of this community was a high, thick wall. He needed a bridge, someone who could cross that barrier for him. That's when he remembered an old acquaintance, Claire, a lawyer who had left a promising career in corporate law to dedicate herself to a small community law project providing legal aid to families in underserved neighborhoods. He hadn't seen her in years, but he remembered her passion and her deep understanding of the reality of these people. He found her in a modest office, overflowing with files and smelling of strong coffee. Claire, with her hair in a messy bun and reading glasses perched on her nose, listened to his story with unwavering attention. She didn't seem surprised by the hostility he had faced. "Richard, you showed up there in a luxury car, flashing cash. To them, you're either a problem or an opportunity for exploitation." They don't know a middle ground, she explained, her voice calm and didactic. This girl, Lena, if what the bodega owner said is true, she's solely responsible for her sister. The mother, from what I know of similar cases, is likely gone or has serious issues. Lena has learned to be invisible to survive. Your appearance is a threat to that system. Claire's analysis was cold, but accurate. Richard felt naive. I just want to help, Claire. The debt I owe her, it's immeasurable. What do I do? Claire rested her elbows on the desk, her gaze sharp. The help you want to offer can't feel like humiliating charity. It has to be practical, respectful. The first step is to understand their real situation. This Hawks character, the landlord, I know his reputation. He exploits his tenants, charges outrageous interest. And the sister, Sophia, if she's always sick, she needs medical care they certainly don't have. She picked up a notepad. Tomorrow, one of our social workers, a Ms. Iris, is doing her routine rounds in the neighborhood. She's respected there. If anyone can get close to Lena without scaring her off, it's her. You can go with her, but you have to be discreet. Watch, listen, don't offer anything, just understand. The next day, Richard swapped his suit for jeans and a simple shirt. He met Ms. Iris, a woman with white hair and a kind smile, at the entrance to the community. The contrast between her reception and his was stark. People greeted her, smiled, told her their problems. She was a part of this place. Guided by her, Richard walked through the same alleys where he had felt like an intruder. Ms. Iris led him to a shack at the back of a vacant lot, with walls of makeshift plywood and a patched asbestos roof. The door was ajar. Inside, in a single dark and damp room, he saw Lena. She was sitting on the concrete floor next to a thin mattress where little Sophia slept, her breathing shallow and raspy. Lena was trying to fix her sister's only doll, sewing one of its arms back on with a needle and thread. The concentration on her face was the same she'd had at the airport, focused, determined. She didn't notice their presence. In that small space, poverty wasn't just the lack of things, it was the absence of air, of light, of hope. Sophia's cough echoed in the silence, a fragile, painful sound. Ms. Iris approached slowly. Lena, sweetie, it's me, Iris. The girl looked up with a start. Her eyes widened when she saw Richard behind the social worker. She immediately shot to her feet, her body tense, positioning herself between the visitors and her sleeping sister like a little wolf protecting her cub. The fear on her face was palpable. "What does he want?" she asked, her voice a trembling whisper, but loaded with an accusation that struck Richard to the core. He wasn't a savior here. He was a threat. Miss Iris acted with the wisdom of years of experience. She ignored Richard's presence for a moment, focusing all her attention on the girl. "I came to see how you two are doing, honey. I heard Sophia's cough from outside. Does she have a fever?" Her voice was as soft as a caress, disarming Lena's hostility bit by bit. The girl's shoulders relaxed minimally, but her eyes still watched Richard. "A little," she admitted, her voice low. "I gave her the syrup the lady at the clinic gave us last time." Richard watched the scene in silence, feeling like an intruder in an intimate and painful drama. Every detail of the room was a blow to his conscience. The rusted two-burner hot plate, the single pot on it, the few clothes folded in a cardboard box, the lack of any fresh food. The doll Lena was trying to fix had a stained face and tangled hair, but it was clearly Sophia's most prized possession. The social worker touched the sleeping girl's forehead. "She's burning up, Lena. This syrup won't be enough. She needs a real doctor." The mention of a doctor brought the tension back to Lena's face. "We don't have money," she said, the sentence sounding like a final verdict. It was at that moment that Richard, following a discreet signal from Miss Iris, took a step forward. He tried to modulate his voice to sound as gentle and harmless as possible. "Lena, my name is Richard. I'm the father of the boy at the airport. her eyes fixed on him, a flicker of recognition but no change in her defensive expression. "You saved his life. I can never thank you enough. I want to help you and your sister. Take Sophia to a good doctor. Make sure you have food to eat, a safe place to live." His words, which he had imagined would sound like a relief, seemed to have the opposite effect. Lena's suspicion intensified, turning into something close to panic. She took a step back, pulling a thin blanket over Sophia's body, as if to hide her. "We don't need your help," she said, her voice trembling. "We get by." Just then, a shadow fell across the doorway. A tall, thin man with an oily smile and small, calculating eyes entered the shack uninvited. It was Hawks, the landlord. "Well, well, what have we here? Important visitors on my property," he said, his gaze shifting from Mrs. Iris to Richard, lingering on his expensive shoes. "Ms. Iris always looking out for the poor, and you, sir, I don't know you from around here." Hawks completely ignored the girls. His focus was on Richard, on the scent of money he exuded. "Heard you were looking for the little hero," he continued with a mocking tone. "Well, you found her, and you also found the one responsible for them. As you can see, things are tough. Rent's 3 months late. I'm a good-hearted man, but patience has its limits." He moved closer to Richard, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "If you really want to help, we can talk. A settlement, let's say, to clear their debt, and maybe ensure they continue to have a roof over their heads. We can handle this between businessmen." The extortion was clear, shameless. Richard felt his blood boil. He was about to respond when little Sophia began to cough violently, a fit that made her sit up on the mattress, her face red from lack of air. Lena rushed to her side, holding her and whispering words of comfort. The sick child's crisis was more real and urgent than any veiled threat. Hawks looked at the scene with indifference. "Like I said, her health isn't good. A better place would do her good." He looked directly at Richard, his eyes gleaming with greed. "Everything has a price, doesn't it?" Richard was cornered. On one side, the distrust of the girl he desperately wanted to help. On the other, the greed of a man who saw misery as an opportunity. And at the center of it all, a sick child whose life seemed to depend on the decisions he would make in the next few minutes. Sophia's convulsive sobs cut through the tense air. Lena rocked her, her small, serious face contorted in anguish. For Richard, that sound was a catalyst. The anger he felt toward Hawks and the frustration with Lena's distrust dissolved, replaced by a searing clarity. Nothing mattered but getting that sick child out of there. "Enough," Richard said, his voice low but vibrating with an authority that made Hawks take a step back. He knelt in front of Lena, ignoring the dirty floor. He didn't look at her like a benefactor, but like a pleading father. "Lena, please, look at your sister. She needs a hospital now. I don't want anything in return. I swear, just let me help Sophia. Afterward, if you want, I'll disappear and you'll never see me again. But please let me do this." His eyes sought hers, trying to convey the sincerity that words could not express. He saw the battle raging within her, fear against need, the instinct to protect against the evidence of her sister's illness. "Ms." Iris placed a gentle hand on Lena's shoulder. "He's right, honey. Sophia needs to go. I'll go with you. I won't leave your side." The social worker's presence seemed to be the tipping point. Lena looked at her sister's feverish, sweaty face, then at Richard. She finally nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. It was enough. Richard stood up and faced Hawks. "Get out of my way." He gathered Sophia into his arms with a care that surprised him. The girl was as light as a feather, her body burning against his. Hawks tried to block the path. "Hey! What about our talk? The debt?" "We'll deal with that later," Richard growled. "Now, if you don't move, I'll call the police and report you for coercion and for keeping children in unsafe living conditions." The threat worked. Hawks moved aside, his face twisted in anger. Richard left the shack with Lena and Miss Iris at his heels and led them to Davis's car. The drive to the best private hospital in the city was a blur of imaginary sirens in Richard's head. Lena didn't say a word, just held her sister's hand, her eyes fixed on the unfamiliar landscape of wealthy neighborhoods passing by the window. At the hospital, the sterling name once again opened all doors. Sophia was taken immediately to the pediatric emergency room. As they waited in the sterile waiting area, the tension between Richard and Lena remained. She sat on the edge of her chair, her body rigid, ready to flee at any moment. Hours passed. Finally, a young, competent-looking doctor approached them. "Mr. Sterling," Richard jumped to his feet. "That's me. How is she?" The doctor wore a serious expression. "We've managed to stabilize her. The high fever was a symptom of a severe bacterial pneumonia. It's in an advanced stage. If you had waited a few more hours..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. It was a terrible echo of what had happened with Leo. "Is she going to be okay?" he asked, his voice failing. "She'll need to be in the ICU for a few days on strong medication. Her lungs are severely compromised," the doctor explained. "But there's something else that concerns us more. In her blood work, we found markers that indicate an underlying chronic condition, a rare autoimmune disease that affects the lungs. It's why she gets sick so often. She needs continuous, specialized treatment that, frankly, is extremely expensive and difficult to access." The revelation landed like a bomb. It wasn't just pneumonia, it was a sentence. Sophia's condition wasn't a temporary problem that money could solve with a single action. It was a long, complex, and costly battle. Lena, who had listened to everything in silence, finally spoke. Her voice was a thread, but her words were steel. "I'm not leaving her alone." The doctor looked at her with compassion. "Honey, children can't stay in the ICU." "I'm not leaving this hospital," Lena repeated, her eyes shining with stubborn tears. "I'll stay in the hallway. I'll stay by the door. But I'm not leaving." In that moment, Richard understood. The debt he felt wasn't something that could be paid with a check. He couldn't just fix the situation and go back to his life. By pulling the girls out of that shack, he had pulled them into his world. And now, their fate was irrevocably intertwined with his eye, in a way far deeper and more terrifying than he could ever have imagined. The days that followed were an immersion into a parallel reality. Richard, accustomed to running his life from a corner office with a panoramic view, now spent most of his time in the white, silent corridors of the hospital. He became a fixture in the pediatric ICU waiting room, a place where time seemed to crawl and hope was a fragile commodity. True to her word, Lena refused to leave. She found a small nook by a water fountain, a spot from which she could see the double doors leading to the unit where Sophia was. There she sat, on the floor, hugging her knees, a miniature sentry. The nurses, at first hesitant, soon grew fond of her silent devotion, bringing her snacks and blankets. Richard tried everything to get her to go somewhere more comfortable. He rented a hotel room nearby, bought new clothes, coloring books, toys. She accepted the food and water but refused everything else. "I have to be here when she wakes up," was her only explanation. Her presence was a constant mirror for Richard. He saw in her resilience the fragility of his own paternal involvement. How many times had he delegated Leo's care to nannies and grandparents so he wouldn't miss a meeting? How many nights had he spent reviewing contracts while his wife tended to his son's fever or nightmare? Lena's unwavering dedication was not just touching, it was a silent indictment of his own absence. Their communication was minimal, made up of gestures and short sentences. He brought her breakfast. She would nod in thanks. He would pass on updates from the doctors. She would listen, her face impassive, absorbing every word. Slowly, however, Lena's wall of distrust began to show small cracks. One day, she saw him on the phone. his voice tense as he spoke with David about a deal that was falling apart. When he hung up with a frustrated sigh, she asked, her voice barely audible, "Are you okay?" The simple question caught him off guard. "Yes, just work problems," he replied. She was silent for a moment, then said, "You look tired. How's your son?" The mention of Leo touched him deeply. "He's fine. He's at home with his grandmother. He misses me." "You should go see him," Lena said, without looking at him. "He needs his dad." Coming from her, the ultimate guardian, the advice carried enormous weight. That night, Richard went home. Leo's hug, the smell of his hair, the feel of his small body nestled against his, it all felt more vivid, more precious. He read Leo a bedtime story, something he hadn't done in months. As his son fell asleep in his arms, he thought of Lena, alone in the hospital corridor. The complexity of his situation began to deepen. Claire, the lawyer, updated him on developments in the neighborhood. Hawks, furious at being challenged, was spreading malicious rumors that Richard had kidnapped the girls. Some neighbors, driven by envy or fear, corroborated the story. The bodega owner, on the other hand, tried to defend the truth, but his voice was one among many. Furthermore, the absence of the girl's mother had become a legal problem. The hospital needed a legal guardian to authorize more complex procedures. "Child Protective Services has been notified, Richard," Claire said over the phone. "They're going to open a case to investigate the abandonment. That means when Sophia is discharged, they can't go back to that apartment, and there's no guarantee they'll stay together. They could be sent to different group homes." The news was a gut punch. He had saved them from a disease, only to throw them into a bureaucratic, inhuman maze that could separate them forever. The promise he had made to himself to fix the situation seemed increasingly arrogant and naive. The next day, he returned to the hospital with a new determination. He found Lena in the same spot, but something was different. She was holding a drawing made with colored pencils a nurse had given her. On the paper were two figures holding hands, one larger and one smaller, under a smiling sun. Next to them was a third figure, tall and awkward, who could only be him. Before he could say anything, a stern-looking woman with a clipboard approached them. "Lena, I'm the social worker from Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you, and with you as well, Mr. Sterling." The social worker, Mrs. Albright, had a gaze that seemed trained to find flaws. She led them to a small meeting room off the main lobby, a sterile space with a table and 3 chairs. The formality of the setting contrasted brutally with the raw intimacy of the corridor where Lena had kept her vigil. Richard sat, feeling as though he were in an interrogation. Lena sat beside him, her small hands hidden under her legs, her body shrinking into itself. "We received a report from the community," Mrs. Albright began, her voice neutral but loaded with implications. Allegations that the girls were removed from their home without a guardian's consent. Furthermore, the school reports that Lena has been absent for weeks. Each word was a brick in the construction of a legal case Richard didn't understand, but whose consequences he was beginning to fear. He tried to explain the medical emergency, the urgency of Sophia's situation, but Mrs. Albright interrupted him with pointed, bureaucratic questions. "Do you have any family relation to the minors? No. Do you have legal custody of them? No. Did you notify the proper authorities before removing them from their residence? No." The cold logic of the law was twisting his act of compassion into a transgression. The focus of the conversation then turned to Lena. Mrs. Albright softened her voice, but the questions were like tiny needles. "Lena, where is your mother? Do you know how to find her?" Lena shook her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. "She went on a trip," she whispered. "When is she coming back?" Lena shrugged. "Do you eat properly? Who cooks for you?" "I know how to cook," Lena answered, with a hint of defensive pride. "I take care of Sophia." "That's not your responsibility, sweetie. You're a child. Your place is in school, playing." Mrs. Albright said it with professional kindness. But to Lena, it sounded like a threat. The idea that caring for Sophia wasn't her responsibility was inconceivable. It was the center of her universe. Richard intervened. "Mrs. Albright, what's going to happen to them? Sophia needs a long and complex treatment. They can't be separated. Lena is the only emotional support her sister has." The social worker sighed, the first sign of emotion on her face. "Mr. Sterling, I understand your good intentions, but the law is clear. They are in a situation of abandonment and vulnerability. The standard procedure is to place them in a group home, where they will receive the necessary care. We will do our best to keep them in the same facility, but I can't make any guarantees. The priority is their safety and well-being." The words "group home" hung in the air, cold and terrifying. Lena's head snapped up, panic stamped across her features. She looked at Richard, a silent appeal that pierced him. He had saved her. He had brought her here. He couldn't let them be taken away. In that moment, he made an impulsive decision, one of those that changes the course of a life. "No, they will not go to a group home," he said, his voice firm. "They will stay with me." Mrs. Albright raised her eyebrows. "Mr. Sterling, that's impossible. You're not a relative. To obtain custody, even temporary custody, requires a long and complex court process. It requires psychological and social evaluations, proof of a bond." "Then let's start the process," he interrupted. "I'll hire the best lawyers. I'll meet every requirement. But in the meantime, they remain my responsibility. I will provide a home, caregivers, everything they need. But they are not going to a group home, and they will not be separated." It was a bluff, a leap in the dark. He had no idea what he was promising, of the implications for his life, his family, his work. His wife, Helen, was thousands of miles away, enjoying her vacation. How would she react to finding out he planned to bring two unknown children into the center of their lives? But seeing the flicker of hope in Lena's eyes, he knew he couldn't go back. Mrs. Albright stared at him, assessing him. "This is highly irregular, but given the younger sister's health condition, it might be possible to file for emergency provisional custody, with intensive monitoring from our agency, but it would be a battle, Mr. Sterling, a legal and personal battle. Are you sure you're prepared for that?" He looked at Lena, who for the first time was looking at him not with fear, but with a fragile, terrified trust. He was risking everything, diving into a world of complications he could barely predict. "Yes," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction he didn't know he possessed. "I'm absolutely sure." The word "yes" was easy to say. Living with its consequences was another story. Richard plunged into a bureaucratic hurricane. Claire, the lawyer, took the case, but warned him of the difficulty. "Richard, family court judges are extremely cautious. A wealthy man, effectively single while his wife is away, wanting custody of two poor girls with whom he has no blood ties. The narrative that Hawks and the hostile neighbors are creating in the community doesn't help. They'll paint you as an eccentric, perhaps even with questionable intentions." Claire's prediction proved correct. The first hearing for emergency custody was a disaster. Hawks's lawyer, hired by some mysterious figure, presented himself as a friend of the family, concerned for the girls' welfare. He used the neighbors' testimonies to portray Richard as a stranger who had snatched them from their home, insinuating dark motives. The judge, a conservative and skeptical man, deferred the decision, demanding a series of psychosocial reports and a full case study. While the legal battle dragged on, Richard's life transformed. He practically moved into the hospital. His business empire began to suffer from his absence. David, his right-hand man, called daily with problems Richard used to solve in minutes. Now his mind was divided, and for the first time, business wasn't his priority. The news finally reached Helen. his wife. The phone call was tense. "Richard, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and irritation. "I go away for a few weeks, and you decide to adopt 2 children. Have you lost your mind?" "What about Leo? Where does he fit into all this?" He tried to explain, to tell her about the airport, about Sophia's pneumonia, about Lena's helplessness. But from a distance, the story sounded absurd, impulsive. "We're talking about our life, Richard, our family. You can't just make a decision like this on your own," she said, before hanging up abruptly. The loneliness he felt after that call was profound. He was on an island, fighting a war on multiple fronts, and the people who should have been his allies were pulling away. At the hospital, however, something different was blooming. Lena, witnessing his fight for them, began to lower her guard. Their communication evolved from monosyllables to conversations. She told him about Sophia, how her sister loved stories about stars, and how her biggest dream was to have a dog. She told him about their mother, fragmented memories of a woman who was increasingly absent. Lost in a sadness Lena didn't understand, and she told him about the knowledge that had saved Leo. Sophia had an attack once, when she was a baby. Just like that, a neighbor gave her a piece of cake with peanuts in it. Mom just froze, same as you. But Miss Cedar, an old lady who lived there, she did the same thing I did, and she taught me. She said, "A kid who takes care of a kid has to learn to be a grown-up." That simple revelation, the passing of survival knowledge from one generation to the next, showed Richard the strength of the same community that now rejected him. One day, he brought Leo to visit the hospital. He was hesitant, afraid of how the children would react to each other. But the moment Leo saw Lena, he broke into a huge grin and ran to her, hugging her legs. "Lena," he said, his pronunciation still imperfect. Lena, taken by surprise, went rigid for a second. And then a genuine smile, the first Richard had ever seen, lit up her face. She knelt and hugged him back. That afternoon, the two of them sat on the floor of the hallway, playing with one of Leo's toy cars in a comfortable, conspiratorial silence. They were just 2 children, one who had saved the other. The scene gave Richard the strength he needed. He wasn't crazy. He was doing the right thing. That night, Sophia's doctor called him. "I have good news. She's responding well to the antibiotics and can be moved from the ICU to a regular room. She's asking for her sister." The joy that flooded Richard was immense, but short-lived. The doctor continued, "But we have a problem. The treatment for her autoimmune disease. The best option is an experimental drug, only available through a research program in another state. The spots are extremely competitive and the cost is astronomical." It was another obstacle, another mountain to climb. But when he went to tell Lena that she could finally see her sister, the look of pure bliss on the girl's face made any challenge seem small. He would get her into Sophia's room. He would get the medicine. He would fight the whole world for them, even if it meant losing everything he had ever known. Entering the hospital room was like crossing the threshold of a sanctuary. Sophia, pale and small in a bed too big for her, opened her sleepy eyes. When she saw Lena, a weak but radiant smile transformed her face. "Lena," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Lena didn't run. She walked slowly to the bed, as if afraid the image was a mirage. She touched her sister's hand, lacing her thin fingers through hers. No words were spoken for a long time. The reunion was a silent ballet of looks and touches, a communication that transcended language. Richard watched from the doorway, a lump forming in his throat. That connection was the most powerful force he had ever witnessed. This was what he was fighting for. With Sophia out of the ICU, a new set of challenges emerged. Her discharge was approaching, and the question of where the girls would go became more urgent. Richard's petition for temporary custody was still tangled in the legal web. Mrs. Albright, though more sympathetic to his cause after visiting Sophia and witnessing the sisters' bond, was hamstrung by bureaucracy. The judge won't grant you custody without a full evaluation of your home and, crucially, of your wife. Her opinion will be critical to the report, Claire explained. The phone call to Helen was unavoidable. This time, Richard didn't try to downplay it. He poured everything out: the severity of Sophia's illness, the threat of separation, Lena's devotion, how much it had changed his perspective on everything. He didn't ask for permission but shared his conviction, his vulnerability. On the other end of the line, there was a long silence. "Richard," Helen said, her voice finally breaking the static, "my flight back is tomorrow. I'll land in the morning. We'll talk at home." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. It was a storm gathering on the horizon. Meanwhile, he focused on getting the treatment for Sophia. Using his vast network of contacts, he moved heaven and earth. He called CEOs of pharmaceutical companies, renowned researchers, hospital administrators. He met resistance, waiting lists, rigid protocols. Money could buy many things, but it couldn't simply cut the line for a clinical research program. The solution came from an unexpected place. One of the hospital doctors, moved by the girl's story, remembered a colleague who was leading the study. He made a call, not as a favor to a millionaire, but as one doctor's appeal to another on behalf of a patient. The story of the airport rescue, the sisters' devotion, Richard's battle, it all came together to create a human narrative that touched the researcher. Sophia was accepted into the program. It was a monumental victory, but it brought a new complication. The treatment was in another city, hundreds of miles away. How could he manage this? How could he reconcile Leo's life, his crumbling marriage, his business, and now the care of two girls, one of whom needed complex medical treatment in another state? The walls seemed to be closing in. On a particularly bleak afternoon, while waiting for news from his lawyers, he found Lena sitting by Sophia's window, teaching her sister how to make an origami bird from a hospital brochure. Her concentration and patience were mesmerizing. "Why do you do it?" Richard asked, approaching. "Why do you take care of her so fiercely?" Lena didn't look up from the paper she was folding. "Because she's my sister," she said, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. "When Mom got really sad, she would forget about us, forget to make food, forget to give us a bath. But I didn't forget. I promised myself I would never forget Sophia. Someone has to remember." The simplicity of that promise, made by a child to herself, revealed to Richard the true nature of commitment. It wasn't about money or power. It was about remembering, about being present. At that moment, his cell phone rang. It was Claire. "Richard, bad news. Hawks and his lawyer got a court order. They're claiming you're holding the girls in unlawful imprisonment and alienating them from their community. The judge has scheduled an emergency custody hearing for tomorrow, and he's ordered CPS to take the girls to a group home immediately after the hearing, pending the outcome of the case." The bottom dropped out. The battle he thought he was fighting from a distance had arrived at his door. Tomorrow, he could lose them. The courtroom was cold and imposing, a universe of dark wood and solemn silence designed to intimidate. Richard sat next to Claire, his expensive suit feeling like an inadequate costume for the storm raging inside him. Across the room, Hawks and his lawyer whispered, their smug smiles barely concealed. Lena and Sophia were not present. They were kept in a separate room with Ms. Iris, a small mercy in a cruel process. The judge entered, and the hearing began. Hawks's lawyer spoke first. He painted a twisted and venomous picture, describing Trestlewood as a place of strong ties and community support from which the girls were ripped away by a capricious millionaire. He called neighbors as witnesses, who, whether coached or intimidated, spoke about how Lena was a difficult girl and how the mother needed help, not to have her children taken. Every word was a knife. When it was Claire's turn, she was methodical and precise. She presented Sophia's medical reports, detailing the severity of her condition and the medical neglect she had suffered. She presented the testimony of the bodega owner, who spoke of the girl's abandonment and Hawks's exploitation, but it was one man's word against many. The air in the room was heavy, the scales of justice tipping dangerously in the wrong direction. The judge seemed impassive, his face a mask of neutrality. "Mr. Sterling," he said, addressing Richard for the first time, "your actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, were irregular. You acted outside the law. Why should I believe that your interest in these children is genuine and not some passing whim?" Richard stood. He looked at the judge, but he didn't just see a man in a robe. He saw the embodiment of a system that was about to fail two innocent children. He took a deep breath and began to speak, not as a calculating businessman, but as the man who had been reborn on the floor of that airport. He spoke of the panic, of the helplessness. He spoke of Lena's courage, of the knowledge she carried like a burden and a blessing. "Your Honor, I don't know much about the law. I know about profit and loss, and for my entire life, I've measured my success in numbers. But over the last few weeks, I've learned that true value isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you refuse to lose." His voice echoed in the silent room. "I saw true responsibility in the eyes of a 7-year-old girl. She doesn't take care of her sister out of obligation, but because it's the only thing that gives her life meaning. Separating them isn't protecting them. It's destroying the only family they know. It's breaking their spirits." He paused, his gaze meeting the judge's. "You ask if my interest is genuine. My interest doesn't matter. What matters is that Sophia needs a treatment that only I can provide, and she needs her sister by her side to have the strength to fight. Placing them in a group home now would be a sentence. I'm not asking for myself. I am begging for them." A profound silence followed his speech. The judge looked down at his papers, his face still unreadable. As he finally raised his head, a figure hurried in through the back doors of the courtroom. It was Helen, Richard's wife. Her eyes met his, and for an instant the world stopped. She walked to the front, asking the judge's permission to speak. "Your Honor, my name is Helen Sterling. I am this man's wife." Her voice was firm, clear. "I have just arrived from a trip. I have just learned the full details of this story. And I have to say, at first, I thought my husband had lost his mind." Hawks smiled, victorious. "But then," Helen continued, turning to look at Richard with an expression he hadn't seen in years, a mixture of love and admiration. "I went to the hospital before coming here. I saw the two girls. I saw the way the older one cares for the younger one, and I saw the way my husband looks at them. The man I saw today is not the work-obsessed executive I married. He is the man I fell in love with, a man who is willing to risk everything, not for a deal, but for compassion." She turned back to the judge. "If you are concerned about the family environment these girls would be entering, don't be. They won't just have one guardian, they will have two. They will have a family, our family." Her public, unshakable declaration changed the atmosphere in the room. It was the character testimony no psychosocial evaluation could buy. The judge looked from Helen to Richard, then down at the papers before him. He cleared his throat, the decision finally forming on his face. He was about to pronounce his ruling. "Considering the exceptional nature of these circumstances," the judge began, his voice echoing in the now completely silent room, "especially the critical health condition of the minor Sophia and the evident emotional interdependence between the sisters, I will make an equally exceptional decision." He paused dramatically, his eyes sweeping over every face in the room. Richard's heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. "The claim of kidnapping is dismissed. Mr. Sterling acted to save a life. However, his subsequent conduct was irregular. The law must be respected." He looked directly at Richard and Helen. "Nevertheless, the well-being of the children is the highest law in this court. To send these girls to institutional care at this moment would be In my opinion, an act of bureaucratic cruelty. It would be punishing them for their own abandonment. He picked up his gavel. Therefore, I grant the petition for emergency provisional custody to Mr. Richard Sterling and Mrs. Helen Sterling, effective immediately. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was like a clap of thunder, shattering the tension. Richard felt the air rush back into his lungs. He turned to Helen, and in a gesture they hadn't shared in a very long time, they embraced right there in the middle of the courtroom. Tears of relief streamed down Richard's face, mingling with his wife's. Across the room, Hawkes's face contorted into a mask of fury and disbelief. He stood to protest, but the judge silenced him with a look. "And as for you, Mr. Hawkes," the judge continued, his tone now icy, "the evidence of exploitation and neglect presented here is disturbing. I'm referring this case to the district attorney's office for a full investigation of your activities." Hawkes's defeat was total and humiliating. He scurried out of the room, followed by his lawyer, leaving only the echo of his greed behind. When Miss Iris brought Lena and Sophia back into the room, the atmosphere had completely changed. Lena looked from Richard to Helen, then to Claire, who was smiling broadly, trying to understand what had happened. Richard knelt in front of her. "Lena, the judge said you can stay with us, you and Sophia, together." Lena's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were not of fear or sadness. They were of a relief so profound it seemed to hurt. She didn't cry, but a single sob escaped her lips. She looked at her sister, who was dozing in Miss Iris's lap, and then back at Richard. And then she did something he never would have expected. She took a step forward and hugged him, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. It was an embrace of surrender, of trust finally earned. Richard held her, feeling the weight and the lightness of this small life in his arms. In that moment, he wasn't a millionaire, an executive, or a mogul. He was just a father of 3. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Sophia was discharged from the hospital. They didn't go to Richard's mansion, but to a cozy apartment Helen rented near the hospital and a good school, a neutral space where the new family could form without the weight of the past. New clothes were bought. Toys were chosen, rooms were decorated. Leo, instead of being jealous, was enchanted with his new big sisters. He followed Lena everywhere, mimicking her gestures, while Sophia, still weak, watched him from an armchair with an amused smile. The road ahead was still long. Sophia's treatment would begin soon, requiring travel and constant care. Lena's adjustment to a life with rules, schedules, and above all, security, would be a delicate process. The battle for permanent custody would take months, maybe years, but the most important victory had already been won. One sunny afternoon, as they were settling into the new apartment, Richard found Lena standing on the balcony, looking out at the city. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. She pointed to a park below, where children were running and playing. "I never had time to play like that," she said, not with self-pity, but as a simple statement of fact. "Well," Richard said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "now you have all the time in the world." He looked at Helen, who was making a snack in the kitchen with Sophia by her side, and at Leo, who was building a tower of blocks on the rug. His organized, predictable life had been imploded. In its place was something chaotic, uncertain, and infinitely richer. He thought of the airport, the smell of ice cream, the panic that had nearly consumed him. That moment of terror had, in fact, been the beginning of his own salvation. 2 years passed. The airport terminal was as busy and loud as it had been on that fateful day. But for Richard, the place had been transformed. It was no longer a stage for panic, but a gateway to new beginnings. He held the hand of Leo, now 4 and chattering non-stop about the plane that would take them on their first complete family vacation. Beside him, Helen helped a 6-year-old Sophia adjust the backpack on her shoulders. Sophia, though still requiring care, had rosy cheeks and eyes bright with health. The experimental treatment, combined with love and stability, had worked what the doctors called a miracle. A little ahead of them, 9-year-old Lena was engrossed in a book. She was the top student in her class, a voracious reader with an insatiable curiosity about the world. The serious, wary girl still existed somewhere inside her, but now her face broke easily into smiles, especially when Leo did something silly. Permanent custody had been granted 6 months ago, a formality after 2 years of flawless reports from social services. The girl's mother was never found, a painful absence that they, as a family, were learning to navigate together. Hawks, meanwhile, was facing multiple lawsuits for exploitation and fraud, his greed finally catching up with him. "Daddy, scream!" Leo's voice cut through Richard's thoughts. The same word, in the same place. Richard felt a momentary chill, a shadow of the old fear. He looked at the ice cream kiosk, now a complex symbol of both negligence and redemption. He knelt in front of his son. "Of course, champ, but how about chocolate? No nuts, no pistachios, just chocolate." Leo nodded happily. As Richard walked toward the kiosk, he felt a small hand slide into his. It was Lena. She didn't say anything, just walked with him. It was a simple gesture of solidarity, a silent acknowledgement of the memory they both shared of this place. She understood. When they returned with the ice cream, they found Helen showing Sophia the airplanes taxiing on the runway through the massive glass window. The scene was so normal, so full of everyday happiness, that it felt almost sacred. This family, forged in chaos and cemented in unconditional love, was the most improbable and valuable achievement of his life. He realized the true transformation hadn't just been his. Lena had saved Leo with her practical knowledge, but in doing so, she had also saved them all. She had saved Sophia by giving her a chance to fight. She had saved Helen from a marriage that had become a business partnership, and she had saved him from himself, from a life empty of purpose, lived on autopilot. The ultimate rescue had come not from his money or his influence, but from the courage of a little girl who dared to act when everyone else just watched. She had taught him that attention is the purest form of love, and that true strength isn't in controlling the world, but in caring enough to let it change you. The boarding call echoed through the speakers. They gathered their carry-on bags and walked toward the gate, a noisy, happy family in the midst of the crowd. As they passed the exact spot where Leo had fallen, Richard paused for a second. The sweet smell of ice cream still hung faintly in the air, a sensory reminder that no longer haunted him, but reminded him of his gratitude. He looked at his 3 children, at his wife, and knew, with a certainty that surpassed any profit spreadsheet, that he was the richest man in the world.